Welcome all. My clock has officially struck noon here in Chicago, so we are going to get started. We welcome you to our Graham conversation on the past, present, and future of the American musical with editorial page editor and theater critic Chris Jones of the Chicago Tribune. I am Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say that I am the Dean of the Graham School here at the University of Chicago. And I enthusiastically welcome you to our campus virtually on this sunny day here in Chicago and Hyde Park. I am very proud, for those of you who are not familiar, to briefly introduce the Graham School. We are one of the founding divisions of the University of Chicago. We started because when William Rainey Harper was imagining this university with John D. Rockefeller, both pictured before you, they wanted to revolutionize university study in this country. And their idea was to create an extension, the first of its kind in the United States, that would allow universities to bring their learning resources to people across all ages and stages of life and in all places. And so for more than 130 years, we have been blazing new paths in lifelong learning. We are proud to have started distance learning in 1895, just a little bit ahead of the Zoom moment, in those days on correspondence via post. And we have continued to innovate ever since in building new ways to bring the biggest ideas to the world of learners. And our approach remains very much the same today, that we want to explore the big ideas that challenge and change the world. And we have programs across the arts, sciences, and society. 4 main program areas: a Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the world. We also have a basic program where you can go deep into studying the great books of Western tradition. We have open enrollment that allows you to pore over all of the disciplines in our university. And we have annual programs, including a Know Your Chicago series that just finished recently and that allowed more than 600 learners to come together to learn more about our city of Chicago. I also want to acknowledge that we are now into the season of giving, with Thanksgiving later this week. And I want to say a huge thank you on behalf of the school to all of you for being part of our vibrant learning community. I want to especially thank the incredible supporters and Graham Circle members, many of whom I see here, for opening the doors of this university to a broader community of learners. We were thrilled in the last year to see a more than 250% increase in the number of people participating as donors in our Graham Circle and in other parts of the school. And that has allowed us to more than triple the number of scholarships that were given out to learners this autumn, very, very expansively broadening our doors as an institution. I do want to mention 2 notes related to the holidays. We have a book drive going on now with the ability to donate gently used books at the Bleacher Center. And those books go into my very own library and help to ensure that kids in our community have access to all of the texts of the liberal arts. I also want to mention that we'll be having a gathering, and I'll put all of this in the chat momentarily, on broadening access even further. We are thrilled to have moved from 26 learners on scholarship last autumn to over 90 this autumn. But we believe we have more work to do in continuing to open the doors and ensure that the learners that find their way to Graham represent the incredible community of Chicago and the broader world that we're part of. And I'll put in the chat as well how you can participate in that gathering. But the reason that you are all here today, and I'm going to spotlight him now so you can see him, is to hear from Chris Jones, editorial page editor, as well as chief theater critic for the Chicago Tribune. He also serves as the Broadway critic for the New York Daily News, and his latest book, Rise Up, Broadway and American Society, From Angels in America to Hamilton, and there we have it, is a master class, although better to take his real class at Graham, in how to understand theater. He has a PhD from Ohio State and lives in Chicago with his wonderful partner and kids. And so with that, Chris, let me turn it over to you. And I'll start with asking you to give a snapshot tour, essentially, of your upcoming course, which looks across the 10 most influential Broadway musicals of the 20th century, from Carousel to Hamilton. And I'll ask you to set the table by just giving just a little bit of what's happening at a high level in the evolution of theater from, right after the Second World War, nearly till today, although I imagine we'll talk about how Hamilton is no longer necessarily, how we represent today, because even it's changed. Give theater a couple of years and nothing stays the same. But let me turn it over to you for commentary on that front.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And hello, everybody. I see a couple of familiar names there too. So it's good to see you. I'm having a bit of a pandemic flashback as I do this, but I'm thrilled to be teaching in person this class this year, this winter anyway. So I would start out by saying, I'll tell you a quick story that last night I went to see The Sound of Music at the Paramount Theater in Aurora, which, by the way, is very good if you're looking for a show to go and see over the holidays. But I was watching The Sound of Music, and I was remembering a play I'd seen on Broadway about a month ago, which is a Tom Stoppard play called Leopoldstadt, which has been one of the big hits of the Broadway season. It's not a musical, so it's not on my class, but it's a play about, it's a play set in Vienna. It is about a Jewish family or successive generations of a Jewish family in Vienna. It's a superb play. It is, if you're in New York now or are going there, it's absolutely the play to see, in my opinion. But one of the contentions of the play deals with sort of the Austrian, it deals with the relationship of Austria and what went on during the Second World War, and very specifically in terms of the Holocaust. And one of its contentions of the play is that that Austria, many Austrians who ran cultural institutions were anti-Semitic, and also very quickly sort of washed themselves, so to speak, of what had happened in the war. And I sat there watching Leopoldstadt, and I was sort of jarred by this notion of Austria, you might say. And I could say it felt to me so different from what the symbolic sense of Austria in the late 1940s, early 1950s that I have in my head. And then last night, I'm sitting in Aurora watching The Sound of Music, and I come to realize that most of my notions of this era and of Austria in this era and of Austria's relationship to the Nazi Party really come from The Sound of Music. And I said to my wife, who was sitting next to me, this has really influenced me. And I think to myself, well, I grew up in the UK in the sort of the 70s and the 80s, and I know it influenced my parents as well, who lived through the war and who were already adults in the war. And I was just struck for a moment that this musical, here we are, this sort of musical that I see almost 3 times a year, that is a wonderful masterpiece of construction, really has informed a lot of how we see, for good and ill, I would say, a lot of how we see those years in Austria directly after the Second World War. And it was just a moment for me to realize the significance of Broadway musicals, especially when they're made into films, to really have an impact on how what we feel. And so my class really is about to sort of to talk about the significance of some of these major musicals. So, some of the examples would include, say, Fiddler on the Roof, which just had a really extraordinary new production at the Lyric Opera here in Chicago. And that too is a piece that really has been a sort of drumbeat of the 20th century. And I had this experience of standing outside of Fiddler on the Roof at the Lyric and thinking to myself, I guess I was watching all of the families going in. Fiddler on the Roof is a show that multiple generations of people explore together. And I was thinking about how central that show and its perceptions are in the way we feel about things. I've always had this beef with Fiddler as a Chicagoan. I'm a 30-year Chicagoan. I'm deeply proud of my city. It always irritates me that all the intellectuals in the show from Anatevka, they all go to New York, and only Laser Wolf the butcher heads to Chicago. And every time I see it, I get mildly frustrated by that. It's a great example of East Coast snobbery, I always think. But Fiddler 2 is another show that we talk a lot about in my course, about what the significance of that has been. And we also talk about many other great musicals, including Gypsy, including Rent, which is a musical that really did change the face of Broadway in so many ways. We talk about, of course, Hamilton, which, as you said, Seth, is a musical now that seemed to be the epitome of the future and now seems sort of dated. It's a sort of fascinating musical to look back on now, because, Hamilton really was created in the cradle of the Obama administration. And I think when historians look back at what the Obama administration stood for, and of course, the University of Chicago is deeply part of this story, the Obama administration really, the values of the Obama administration are really reflected to me in Hamilton. And it's not a surprise to me that the musical literally was created at the White House, very much under the president's eye. And I had another moment of sort of revelation that I'd just like to share for a second, then I'll shut up. But one of the moments of revelation about the significance of musicals, because I know that musicals are often seen as trivial. I mean, maybe when you signed on today, you're like, well, he's just going to talk about musicals. Well, my argument really is that they're actually more central than you think. My example that I would cite was from the Tony Awards. I think it would be the 2016 Tony Awards, if my memory serves. And at that point, I'm sitting, I'm watching the Tony Awards in New York, and up pops Michelle and Barack Obama. And they basically do a promo for Hamilton. And it's the words on the promo go something like, coming up next, see the musical that changed America. He's young, scrappy, and hungry. We'll be right back. And I thought to myself, wow, it sort of went unnoticed. But I thought to myself, that is a really bizarre thing, because Hamilton is a commercial musical. It's a private business. Would the Obamas have done a commercial for Midas tires? They would not. Would they have done a commercial for a trivial musical? They would not. But they actually did a pitch for Hamilton, even though that it was not a nonprofit, it was a private business, as I said. But to the Obamas, it represented all that was good about America and all that they wanted to promote. And that was a very important part of the history in that era. And I think that that moment for me really indicated that the musical had arrived at a place of centrality that was sort of very striking. I remember Rahm Emanuel, the former Chicago mayor, now ambassador to Japan, calling me up and telling me that he was going to Hamilton in New York. And when and then he called me again, said he'd been there, and he said something along the lines of like, all the Obama administration was sitting in the seats. Like people from the Treasury were going to see it, because it was felt and seen as something very, very central. And for a lot of kids who told their parents they wanted to major in drama, and I was one of those kids, this was a moment of where drama really entered the discourse in a way that I would argue it had never entered before. And that to me was a really singular, sort of fascinating achievement. And another example of that, Seth, would be, you might recall Mike Pence went to Hamilton, and he was addressed from the stage by the cast. It was a controversial moment. We talk about it in my class a bit, but it's a controversial moment because you could argue, in fact, I probably would argue, that the vice president is as entitled as anyone else to go to the theater and not be harangued from the stage. But that they took a different tack from that, and they gave the speech to him saying, laying out what they hope for the new Trump administration. I should say that the vice president, or the vice president-elect as he was, when this is prior to the inauguration. And I remember the former President Trump then sent out this angry tweet saying whatever, his usual stuff. And I remember thinking that tweet from Donald Trump was sort of the beginning, really, of Trump's tweets. And as you all probably know, Trump used Twitter. Apparently he's now able to come back, but Trump used Twitter as a means of communication more than any previous president. But if I were to say what was the first incendiary Trump tweet, I bet you wouldn't know that the answer was Hamilton, that he actually was sort of tweeting about Hamilton and how they treated the vice president. So that for me was another example of how musicals in this era, they reach a level of not only respectability, because the form historically, of course, have been a kind of the bastard child of opera in a lot of people's minds. It was seen in some ways as trivial for a large part of the first several decades of Broadway. But my argument in my class really is, excuse my dog barking. My argument in my class really is that the musical becomes more and more substantial and serious as time goes on. And I begin with talking about really Rodgers and Hammerstein, who really start that by dealing with serious themes like life and death, or like in Oklahoma, the idea of American progress and what that really means, and also about the psychological reality of Americans. Like if you look at, say, Laurie in Oklahoma, or if you look at Carrie and in Carousel and Mrs. Snow, you can see how Rodgers and Hammerstein were dealing with the psychological tension of youth in the 1940s and 1950s. So my argument then is that the musical got better with some digressions into the worst, but it also became more substantial. It learned how to be a great American art form over the course of this period.
Well, so you picked up on a number of themes that I know you teach about and that I read in your book, that there's a deep connection between musicals and society, and that we can see that play out in literally the way that it interacts. And, you know, the Obamas or even Trump are examples in some ways of that interaction point. You're also drawing on this idea of the evolution of the form. And I'm curious if we were to take all of that into account and ask you, as someone who studies and writes about this, what you see as the keys to a great musical. So if you had to tell, you know, what's in common across all 10 of these musicals that you've chosen, as different as they are, what would you say are some of the keys to building a great American musical?
Well, I would say first and foremost that musicals build on each other. Typically, I will go and see a musical. So if you look at just last week, I went to see a show called & Juliet on Broadway, which is new. It's a so-called jukebox show, which means that it has not an original score. It uses pop songs in this case. But as I'm watching that musical, 6 musicals that clearly influenced it pop up in my head almost immediately. So the musical, for the most part, is an incremental form. Generally speaking, the musical builds on that which has gone before in a very sort of direct way. There's a very clear lineage, I would say, from Rodgers and Hammerstein to Stephen Sondheim, who was, of course, mentored by Oscar Hammerstein, from Stephen Sondheim to Jonathan Larson, who sadly died so young, but was the creator of Rent, and then from Jonathan Larson to Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was the creator of Hamilton, and then from Lin-Manuel Miranda to a whole variety now of, you know, new composers and writers who are using Hamilton as their template. So the first thing about a great musical is it's almost always openly aware of the four parents of that musical. So that is one too. I'm also I try to talk in the class a bit about lyrics, what makes a great lyric, which is not an easy thing to say authoritatively. But you know, one of the interesting differences between musicals and operas often is that musicals have a variety of different musical styles in them. Stephen Sondheim, who I got to interview 2 or 3 times, said to me on a couple of occasions that, you know, that he didn't like the term through composed. So some of the people in this group might know that there's a phrase in musical theater called through composition, which means shows like Les Mis, Les Miserables is a great example, where there's no book scene, there's no dialogue, they sing every note. And people say, well, that's through composed. And Sondheim always said, well, it's a misnomer, because in a symphony or in a orchestral suite or even in an opera, you generally have a common musical palette, whereas musicals by their nature require many, many different styles. And Sondheim, the greatest composer ever of musicals in my mind, was a master of that, of course. So in other words, a great musical then has many, many different musical styles. And of lyrics, he always said less is more and content dictates form. So it's the idea that a great lyric can be very, very simple. There was a show, I don't know if anyone who's in Chicago, there's an interesting show about, interesting show at Chicago Shakespeare Theater called The Notebook, based on the romantic movie that some of you might know. And the lyrics are incredibly simple. There's a line in it that goes, love, touch, care, I think the lyric is. And it works very, very well because it is very, very simple. So I would say a simple lyric, a good score. And one of the things that, you know, it would take me an hour and a half to try and even tease out what actually is a good score. People talk about hummable melodies, which Sondheim always argued was mostly about repetition, not really about any quality. But there are definitely things that make great scores. And then the other thing about great musicals is they have to tap into the heart and they have to tap into the human emotions. You know, my example of that really is, I remember being at the opening of Jersey Boys, which was a show that features the music of Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. And on that night that I was there, no one had ever seen Jersey Boys at that point. And Bob Gaudio, who was the musical genius behind the Four Seasons, insisted that the arrangements in Jersey Boys are exactly the same as the original recordings of the Four Seasons. So if you, all of the songs that appear in that show sound exactly like you'd heard them. And so I walk into the August Wilson Theater, which is where it was playing, and I sit down surrounded by people from New Jersey, at that point a little bit older than me, although now I'm about that age myself, but when that came out, I wasn't. And I watched them relive their youths. I watched them relive their childhoods. And I had this revelation that those arrangements, had they been changed, would not have done that. And that show would not have been the hit that it became. And I actually thought to myself, the musical is kind of offering nostalgia, but also it's really almost a sense of eternal life. That's sort of what we go to musicals for. We go, you know, to believe that. There's a new musical opening on Broadway next week about the music of Neil Diamond. I actually saw this show in Boston, and Neil Diamond, as you'll probably know, is quite elderly. He's not well. He has, he has various issues going on, as so many of us do. And he was actually there the night I was there, and he was sitting there, and there was this young version of him performing his songs, and everyone singing along to Sweet Caroline, all that. And I look over at him and I'm thinking, this must be bringing him back to life almost. And so musicals, they really do offer that. You know, musicals are a commercial art form. And it's very trendy sometimes to say, well, commercial art forms are debased art forms. But I argue really, mostly, I think, that the commerciality of musicals is actually what it provides, a sort of market discipline for them in some ways, an apt thing to say at the University of Chicago. And that has actually led some creative artists to do their greatest work because of that need, that really imperative of pleasing an audience. It's not some subsidized exhibit on a campus that you can do whatever you want. It's a brutal kind of competitive environment. And that's been true for 100 years or more. And so I think that allows people to do their best work. And there are many, many examples of that. There's a show called The Lion King that's an interesting musical that's been around for 25 years. I just saw it again on Friday for about the 400th time. And I was marveling at how it still works. And I'm thinking to myself, why does this show still work? And what it really does is it tells us that we don't die, we transform. It's about metamorphosis, really, which you can trace back all the way, of course, to Greek mythology and Ovid. But the musical frequently does that. It is often, this is true of Carousel, it's true of many, many musicals where we have a sense that we don't die and lose our loved ones. We actually, and the one that we've lost, loved ones we've lost are not gone from us, but they live on in some form. They're transformed, they're not gone. And that's another key. The musical, my friends, is a fundamentally optimistic form. It can be serious, but musicals without hope generally never work. It's a fundamentally optimistic American form.
Well, so I want to come to our audience questions, but I have one more for you, Chris, before we get there. Because we've talked about the past, we've kind of laid out what makes a great American musical. I want to talk about where you think we are today and where we're headed. And let me lay out a little bit of context behind that question. We talked about Hamilton. That was a very optimistic picture in many ways of American history. There has continued to be a change in society that wouldn't just affect that. There's been social upheaval, there's been the pandemic. If we just take the way that we look at American history today, it is far more contested since Hamilton came out than at the time that it was written. And then there's kind of a change in our mood as a country. We are more polarized than ever before. There was an interesting conversation I had recently with David Brooks as we had an event with him. And he was talking about how Taylor Swift's new album was representative. She had started with the love story and, a very optimistic view, and had come now to this new album, which is much more about, the challenges that we feel at midnight. Apparently that's actually representative. If we look at all, hit pop songs, the number of stories that talk about love has more than halved as a percentage. And the numbers that talk about anxiety and other frustrations has, grown dramatically. And I'm curious, kind of, as you imagine how all of those trends, plus technology, plus at least the imagination that, we're going to be able to experience things like theater in the metaverse. I know those are, a multitude of forces. I'm just curious, where do you think we are today? What musical maybe typifies where you think the zeitgeist is at this moment? And then where are we headed as you imagine the future?
That's a very brilliantly expressed, but very, very difficult question, I think. And I don't know entirely how to answer that, but I'll give it a stab. I think we have to start with the pandemic, and we have to sort of recognize the fact that the pandemic definitely affected the musical. It killed it off, frankly, for close to 2 years. And it remains a force. Like, I get asked all the time if people have returned to the theater, and my answer is always not in full numbers. And that's not an issue that's related to any particular city. It's the same in Chicago, New York. I see it everywhere I go, that I would say audiences are back at about somewhere between 50 and 75%. So if you put on a show tomorrow, that's a show that you would have put on in 19, you would have about 60 or 70% of the audience. And that difference economically has been very, very challenging for the theater, which the musicals require enormous amounts of capital investment, $10 million, $20 million up front with no guarantee of being paid back. And so the pandemic has greatly challenged the form. And the next question people usually ask me is, well, is it permanent? Well, why is that? People say, and I go, well, I don't know. I think it's a combination of fear of some urban environments, which is a real thing. The perception of not wanting to go downtown in some cities is a real thing. Whether it's justified or not, it's not the point. Frankly, the perception exists, and that people have to deal with. That's number one. Number two is, I think the pandemic created introverts out of a lot of us, and that we developed a resistance to going in public into these environments. I feel it myself, and I do it every night, and I still feel it. And I think that has absolutely been a factor as well. And I think habit. is another. The people got out of the habit of going out to these sorts of events, and that habit, I was talking with some professionals about this just last week, that habit has to somehow be rekindled and restarted, and it's very, very difficult. And so I think the first thing we have to say then, Seth, is that right now the musical is still kind of reeling from the pandemic. In terms of your other part of your question, we are seeing far more musicals about identity. So, for example, the Tony winner last year, the A Strange Loop, was a musical fundamentally about identity. And that's an interesting form for the musical. It's somewhat new, I think. And that is a reality. That's where a lot of people are now. And there is a tension, I think, between musicals. Radicals in musicals always struggle with the tension of the form's pull towards unification and shared experience versus the progressive desire to create change. And that has been a tension in the American musical as long as there have been American musicals. And often in the right show, it can create really, really fascinating results. But I do reiterate what I said earlier today, it's an optimistic form, and nihilistic musicals tend to close next week. There's very, very few that have succeeded. But I would argue that optimism does not prevent writing about identity, writing about race, writing about the necessity for social change. It doesn't prevent it. But most successful musicals still, even today, with all of the dissent, all of the disagreement, musicals still have to strive, I think, to bring people together. Stephen Sondheim had a word that he called generous music. And what he meant by generous music was, I don't know if you've ever been to a show or an opera and you thought to yourself, I'm not going to understand this, or it's too complex for me, or too musically complex, or I'm not sophisticated enough. And you went and you were surprised how the music and the lyrics, maybe the book too, welcomed you into the show. And that for me is a definition of generosity, generous music. So I see the musical as a great uniter of America. It's the America that we want to see come back, especially in urban environments, like where the musical lives most readily. And the musical for me is something that brings people together. And I don't think that needs to change. I think that's the crucial role of the American musical.
Well, and I'm starting to get questions in, Chris. I'm
Yeah.
going to go through them in kind of power round form, because we already have 4 that we want to get to in the 12 minutes we have remaining. There's a question about why Annie is not mentioned on your original.
Oh, that's a good question. I have a sudden flashback. This is going to sound pretentious, but it comes in my head, which I actually went once to Charles Strauss's apartment in New York, and everyone was dressed like the characters in Annie. I've never forgotten it. Like they had a housekeeper who looked like, they were at the White House in 1945. I've never forgotten it. Well, Annie's a great musical. So no slight, there are obviously more musicals than I can fit in, but that's a really unique, what show is more optimistic than that, with a heroine that sings about tomorrow again and again. And that's exactly, I think, what it's a perfect example of what I was talking about. I have a great little Annie story. This is a true story, that there was once a production of Annie and they did the whole show. And then in the last scene, Annie woke up back in the orphanage and it was all a dream.
Oh, wow. That would be a real change in the optimism.
I just think it's very funny. I don't think the people that wrote Annie were all that pleased, but it was that is a true thing.
Jim Healy asks, what about optimism in Cabaret?
Well, Jim, that's probably the most cynical musical ever to be successful. It is, but I think Kander and Ebb, Kander and Ebb are my favorite. Well, I just said Sondheim was my favorite, but Kander and Ebb are right up there. And I think that their relationship, the two of them, there's a song they wrote, when the surviving member of that partnership wrote about missing his partner. It's called I Miss the Music. It's in a Chandran Ebb show called Contact. And it speaks to me of the close relationship between those two writers. And Cabaret has some of the most searing, beautiful, romantic songs ever written, but it's a cautionary tale. It says people were sleeping when all of this happened, and it's a cautionary tale, and it's a masterpiece of a show. But I still think it's ultimately a unifying. It's ultimately a unifying show.
Joanne is interested to know about the general reaction to Rodgers and Hammerstein during the quote unquote golden age, when they took on more serious topics like racism in South Pacific, sexism in The King and I. Can you talk a bit about how, especially as we're in a moment where these are being reckoned with, how theater may have looked at these in the past? And I know if we were to look back at some of these, we would still see deep racism and sexism, just to say that out loud. But in their time, they were in some ways pushing the mainstream culture.
Well, that's a great question. That's a great question. And one of the things that the theater is always wrestling with is, what do you do with a revival from, say, 1951 that says certain things that now would not be said, or that explores issues in a way that now would not be explored? And people begin to sort of change things, or they refute them. There was a revival of Oklahoma 2 years ago that really did refute Oklahoma. It was the opposite of what I think the intention of Oklahoma was, although the Rodgers and Hammerstein estate allowed that production to go ahead, and it was not without interest. It was kind of an interesting take on it. But I would say this, that Rodgers and Hammerstein were forces for good. If you look at some of the controversial examples, they certainly had the blinkers on that most Americans of that era probably had the same blinkers. But I would say that if you look at a song like You've Got to Be Carefully Taught, that did more for race relations in America than most anything else of the year that song came out. That it literally that did, I think, in South Pacific, that it did point out, it pointed out to a mainstream Midwestern audience the latent racism that existed. And they could only do that if they had the ears of that audience. And by the time they got to South Pacific, they absolutely had the ears of that audience. And so I would argue that South Pacific, even though now there's other stuff in South Pacific that people find legitimately objectionable, that was still the case. Another one that, for example, that comes up a lot is Carousel, where you have, a woman, Julie Jordan, who stays with an abusive man, and who says, even notoriously says to, you still got me?
Yep, you're back.
Okay, I'm back. A woman who says notoriously to her daughter, sometimes people hit you and you don't feel a thing. And that, of course, is very difficult to do now, and rightly so. But what I would say about that is that Rodgers and Hammerstein in Carousel were never saying that character was making a good choice when she stayed with that man. They were always pointing that out. The musical was not on Billy Bigelow's side, even though it has compassion for him. And at the end, particularly, but even at the end, he screws up. So they were never on his side. And so I always think with Carousel, that's what you have to remember. They really were looking at that relationship from a female point of view for the most part. And that show for me is, if it's done right, quite progressive in the context of its time. And that, of course, is a very important caveat. And I think that's true also, of Oklahoma. If you look at Oklahoma, one of the interesting things about Oklahoma is that if in Carousel, there are two young women in Carousel who pursue completely different paths. One gets married and has lots of kids to a sort of boring guy, but she's okay. And then you have one who makes a choice for her heart, perhaps, but a bad choice, and is thrust into this dysfunctional world, but she can't get out of it somehow because that's who she is. So you have that, right? And then in Oklahoma, those two women are actually in one character. Oklahoma, of course, came first, so they split Laurie in Oklahoma into two for Carousel. But in Laurie in Oklahoma, really you watch in Oklahoma an exploration of how you of the what's going on in a young woman's mind in the 1940s, and well, at least in the writing of the musical of that period. So that I think is a really, I argue Rodgers and Hammerstein were deeply progressive writers who really did a lot of good. But yes, they made compromises to get the mass audience that they needed for those musicals, but they also changed minds. And those songs from those musicals, people forget, were very, very famous. There's a great example of how, well, I guess one thing that happened was the Beatles came along, and the Beatles popularized in pop music writing your own songs. Prior to the Beatles, people often performed songs from musicals. So the songs that people were buying and playing and listening to were things recorded by Sinatra and people of his era were often from musicals. I was just playing last night. I'm a big fan of Sammy Davis. I was just playing Sammy Davis last night, and half of his albums are songs from musicals. That was very common. And so those songs had an enormous impact in the way now that they rarely do, because you have the Taylor Swifts who have so many, who write their own material. But you forget that much of the history of musicals was also the history of popular music in America.
Will Sayali Gove ask any advice to new writers of musicals? So if you were coaching someone on how they can kind of build the next great musical, what would some of your quick takes be?
Well, I think number one is do it, because there's huge demand for good new musicals. They're very difficult, but there is a huge demand for it. And if you can do it, the rewards are great. And I think that's really true. I think you have to look at some of the things I've already said. I think generally speaking, you have to have hope. I think most musicals that work are about life and death. Most great musicals are about death, really, and our attempts to avoid it. and the absurdity of the fact that we can avoid it, and that we die without regard to our deserving and at a time and place not of our choosing. And most musicals confront that. That's my number one piece of advice. Not all of them, but most of them. Almost every show that I've mentioned the last hour has on some level confronted mortality. So I firmly believe that, even if you do it in the most light-handed sort of way, I think that's sort of number one. And I also think that, my other piece of advice is try and hook up with a development place, because musicals tend to take a long time. They tend to require lots of different drafts, and they tend to require the work of a lot of different people. And there are some great musical production places. One of them is at the Eugene O'Neill Center in Connecticut, where I show up occasionally. And there's a guy there called Alex Gemengiani who develops new musicals there. He also teaches here in Chicago at the rival school at Northwestern. So you can get him here too, but he's great. He's the best guy I know when it comes to actually helping young composers develop new musicals. So there's a couple of tips right there.
I'm going to stop you there before you say anything else nice about our peer, just a little humor. Final question that we have here is from Madison Bradshaw. She asks, I'd love to know your thoughts on the economics of producing musical theater and accessibility across generations, socioeconomic statutes. And so maybe you can just talk a little bit about kind of how you see the economics going forward, what you see as the business model in terms of, is it just in theater? Is it a mix of theater and, other media like TV, film? How are you, as you kind of talk with people in the industry, looking at the future of the business of theater, given all the changes that you presented happening?
That's another great question. Musicals are very expensive. Most musicals now are $10 million or much higher than that, 20 million for a big musical. I saw a show that just opened on Broadway last week called Kimberly Akimbo, which actually is based on a play that I first saw at Court at University of Chicago a long time ago. And that musical is written by Janine Tesori, a magnificent composer. That musical has a cast of about 8 people, I think, if my memory serves, 8 or 9, and a small sort of ensemble of musicians, and it's not terribly expensive. So there is a way to do musicals. And I think, frankly, given the economic circumstances in which we all find ourselves now, I think that we are going to see more attention to cost. So I think the days of the so-called mega musical, which probably many people remember, of shows like Miss Saigon or Sunset Boulevard, which I'll never forget, at the Lyric Opera, which toured with, I think, 27 trucks. I remember writing a story back in the 90s for Variety on all of the trucks for Phantom of the Opera pulling into Green Bay, and everyone in Green Bay coming out of their houses and looking at the trucks like it was the circus coming to town. But that was the day before digital scenery and before digital anything. And so I think the expense of those shows from the 90s and the aughts is such now that we won't see them again. You know, and I think that is, so I think we are seeing more efficiently produced shows. Now they're still expensive, but then, you know, look at Taylor Swift tickets, they're expensive too. Live events are expensive, and people will pay if they want to go see it, again, vis-a-vis Taylor Swift. So, which after all is a musical in many ways, given the theatricality of her tours. So I don't think we're suddenly going to see super cheap tickets on Broadway. They are cheaper. You know, one of the interesting things that's happened after the pandemic is that prices have come down. It might not look that way, but if you seek them out, I think we are seeing less price gouging than took place before the pandemic. Like if you want to see Hamilton this weekend in New York, it's a lot less than it was before the pandemic. And that's bad news for the producers, but good news for the theater goer. So I do think that the business model really has to be efficiently sized shows that can sustain themselves. Many musicals on Broadway have running costs well in excess of $500,000 a week. There's a show, I was just talking about a show with a friend of mine called Almost Famous, based on the movie, also opened last week before last. Their running costs are $700,000 a week. $700,000 a week. So they have to sell close to $1 million of tickets every week in order to survive, frankly. And that's not sustainable for every show. And that is a problem. And so I think we have to, the musical industry has to do more to contain costs. But I think they're beginning to see that, and we're beginning to see more efficiently produced shows. And digital technology has reduced costs in many cases, but we don't go to the theater to see a movie. So too much digitization carries perils.
Well, this has been an amazing discussion, Chris. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for teaching in person in Gleacher this winter.
Exciting.
And let me just mention, because Sondheim is your favorite, that next week at around the same time, we are going to be having a conversation where Doug Post, who's another instructor who looks at plays, is going to be having a conversation with John Weidman, who was one of Sondheim's closest collaborators and wrote a lot of plays with him. And so let me just advertise that and mention for those of you who are remote to us and therefore can't be in person with Chris, that Doug's course will be online this winter, so you can continue your journey that way. Thank you for being such an incredible part of our team at Graham. Thank you all for joining us, for learning. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. We hope you have a happy and healthy and optimistic holiday in the tradition of the Great American Musical. Happy all.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Thank you so much.